October 1987. The banks of the Lomba River in southern Angola. A tall, six-wheeled vehicle moves through the dense bush, dust hanging in the heat behind it, and across the broken ground ahead of it sit Soviet-built main battle tanks, dozens of them, the hardcore of an Angolan brigade supplied and trained by Moscow. The vehicle facing them is not a tank. It has wheels, not tracks. Its armour would not stop a tank shell. It was never, in any official document, designed to fight tanks at all. It is an infantry carrier, a box on six wheels built to deliver soldiers to a battle, not to win one against armour. And yet over the days that follow, vehicles exactly like this one will hunt those Soviet tanks through the Angolan bush and destroy them, one after another in numbers that will seem impossible to anyone who looks only at the specifications. The conventional wisdom of every great army on earth said this should not be possible. An infantry fighting vehicle, the doctrine went, had to have tracks. The Soviets built the tracked BMP. The Germans built the tracked Marder. The Americans were building the tracked Bradley. Wheels were for trucks and scout cars. A wheeled fighting vehicle was a compromise, a cheap second best that could never match a tracked machine in a real war. South Africa ignored all of it. Cut off from the world's arsenals by an arms embargo, it built a wheeled fighting vehicle anyway, and named it after a small, fearless animal of the African bush that is famous for one thing above all others, attacking creatures many times its own size, and winning. Its name was the Ratel, the honey badger, and it would prove that the entire world had been wrong about what a fighting vehicle needed to be. To understand why the Ratel existed, you have to understand the peculiar war that South Africa was preparing to fight, and how completely different it was from the war that shaped everyone else's vehicles. The great armies of Europe designed their fighting vehicles for a clash on the compact, developed, road-rich battlefields of central Germany. South Africa's war was the opposite of that in every way. It would be fought across the vast, dry, semi-arid emptiness of southern Africa. Distances measured not in dozens of kilometres but in hundreds and thousands, over terrain with almost no infrastructure, no rail network reaching the front, no fuel depots, no workshops, nothing but bush stretching to the horizon. In that environment, the tracked fighting vehicle that the rest of the world worshipped had a fatal weakness. Tracks wear out. They wear out fast over long distances, and a tracked vehicle cannot simply drive itself 1,000 kilometres to the battle. It has to be loaded onto a transporter, hauled forward and unloaded. And South Africa had neither the transporters nor the roads to do that across the scale of country it had to cover. There was a second hard lesson, learned in blood on the dirt tracks of the bush. The buried landmine was everywhere, and a vehicle that could not survive a mine was a death trap for the men inside it. And there was a third pressure, the one that closed every other door. In 1977, the United Nations made its arms embargo against South Africa mandatory, slamming shut access to the weapons and vehicles that other nations bought off the shelf. Whatever South Africa needed, it would now have to design and build itself, from its own factories, with its own engineers. The country had already taken its first step with the Eland armoured car, a vehicle we have explored before on this channel. A light, fast, hard-hitting machine that killed Soviet tanks across Angola. But the Eland had taught its own lessons. It was small, it carried only 3 men and no infantry, and its petrol engine overheated in the African sun. The next vehicle would have to be bigger, tougher, diesel-powered and able to carry a full section of infantry into the fight. So South Africa made a choice that the rest of the world considered heresy. It built its new infantry fighting vehicle on wheels. 6 of them, driven, powered by a strong turbocharged diesel, with the range and the reliability to drive itself across the subcontinent and arrive at the battle ready to fight. No transporter required. This was the whole argument in a single decision. The tracked vehicles of Europe were better in a short, sharp fight on prepared ground, but they could not get themselves to a battle 1,000 kilometres away across roadless bush. And the Ratel could. It could self-deploy across enormous distances, fight when it arrived, and do it again the next day. For the war South Africa was actually going to fight. Wheels were not the compromise. Wheels were the answer. They named it the honey badger. And anyone who knows the animal understands why. The honey badger is small, low, and unremarkable to look at, and it is one of the most fearless creatures in Africa, known for attacking animals vastly larger than itself, for refusing to back down from lions, for a ferocity entirely out of proportion to its size. It was the perfect name for a wheeled box that was about to start killing tanks. The vehicle that emerged was a 6x6 weighing around 18 to 19 tons, built around a hull shaped and protected to give its crew a real chance against the landmines that haunted the bush. It carried a crew and a full section of infantry, who could fight from inside through firing ports cut into the hull or dismount to assault on foot. Its great strength was its modularity, the way a single proven hull could carry whatever the mission demanded. The standard version mounted a 20mm cannon in its turret, the infantry fighting vehicle proper. The Ratel 60 carried a 60mm mortar. The Ratel 81 carried a larger 81mm mortar for indirect fire support. And then there was the Ratel 90. Onto the wheeled hull, South Africa bolted the exact same 90mm gun turret that had made the little Eland armoured car so deadly, the proven tank-killing weapon firing shape-charge rounds that could punch through steel far thicker than the gun's modest size suggested. Officially, the Ratel 90 was a fire support vehicle, there to blast bunkers and soft targets and support the infantry. Officially, it was not an anti-tank vehicle at all. The Bush would rewrite that job description very quickly. Power came from a turbocharged 6-cylinder diesel engine, producing around 280 horsepower, derived from a robust German commercial design and built to run in the heat and dust. It gave the Ratel a top road speed of over 100 kilometers an hour and a range approaching 1,000 kilometers, the self-deploying reach that was the entire point of the vehicle. That range and that reliability transformed what South African forces could do. A column of Ratels could set off from a base, drive deep into Angola under its own power, fight a battle hundreds of kilometers from any support, and have the fuel and the mechanical endurance to keep going. It carried its infantry, its firepower, and its own logistics across distances that would have stranded a tracked force completely. Now, before we get into the battles where this wheeled honey badger hunted Soviet tanks through the bush, if you are finding this deep dive worthwhile, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it keeps this channel producing content at this depth. Through the early 1980s, the Ratel became the backbone of South Africa's cross-border operations into Angola, the vehicle that carried the mechanized infantry into one major operation after another. In the great sweeps against guerrilla bases and the conventional clashes with Angolan government forces, the Ratel proved exactly what its designers had promised. It could go the distance, arrive ready, and fight. In operations like the large mechanized strikes of 1981, Ratels carried the assault, their 20mm cannons and 90mm guns tearing into fortified positions while the infantry they carried dismounted to clear the ground. The vehicle's mobility let South African commanders do things their enemies could not, racing columns across open country to cut off retreating forces and strike from unexpected directions. But the Ratel's defining hour came in 1987, in the brutal series of battles fought along the Lomba River in southeastern Angola. The Angolan army, FAPLA, had launched a major offensive, and at its core were brigades equipped with Soviet armor, including T-54 and T-55 main battle tanks, the kind of heavy, hard-hitting vehicles the Ratel was never supposed to be able to face. What followed became legend in the South African Armoured Corps. As FAPLA's brigades pushed toward the Lomba, South African mechanized forces built around the Ratel moved to stop them, and the wheeled honey badgers found themselves in direct combat with Soviet tanks. The Ratel 90 crews, in their wheeled fire support vehicles, began to hunt. On the 3rd of October 1987, an entire FAPLA brigade was caught and destroyed along the Lomba. Ratel 90s, using the bush for cover, used their speed and their crew's skill to maneuver onto the flanks and rears of the heavier tanks, where the angled side and rear armor was vulnerable to the 90mm shaped charge round. A wheeled vehicle that the world's doctrine said could never fight a tank was killing them in numbers, tank after tank knocked out across the days of fighting. The method was everything, because the Ratel could never win a stand-up, head-on duel with a tank and survive. Its armor offered no protection against a tank gun. What it had instead was speed, agility, low fuel consumption, and crews who understood that survival depended on never giving the tank a clean frontal shot. The Ratels used the dense bush to close unseen, darted across the broken ground faster than a tank could traverse its turret, and struck from the sides and the rear where the armor was thin. They fought the way the honey badger fights, not by being stronger than the lion, but by being faster, lower, more aggressive, and utterly unwilling to fight on the enemy's terms. It was a victory of mobility and skill over sheer protection, and it worked again and again. But honesty demands the limits be named because they were real, and they were deadly. The Ratel could kill tanks, but it could not survive what a tank could do to it in return, and crews who lost the advantage of surprise or terrain paid a terrible price. Against the latest and most heavily armored Soviet tanks, the 90mm gun's effectiveness fell away, and a frontal engagement was often suicide. The South African command knew this perfectly well. As the 1987 and 1988 fighting escalated against ever heavier Soviet armor, they brought their own Oliphant main battle tanks forward to do the heavy work that no wheeled vehicle should be asked to do. The Ratel had proven it could punch far above its weight, but there was a weight class above which even the bravest honey badger could not go. and pretending otherwise got men killed. The vehicle's genius was real, and so were its boundaries. On paper, the tracked fighting vehicles the world preferred all looked superior. The Soviet BMP was lower, harder to hit, and could swim across rivers the Ratel had to ford. The German Marder and the American Bradley were better armoured and built around the assumption of a high-intensity European war. But each of those vehicles was optimised for a battlefield the Ratel never had to fight on. The BMP, for all its sleek low profile, had thin armour and a fearful reputation for burning when hit, a coffin as much as a fighting vehicle. The tracked Western vehicles were superb over a short fight on good ground, but none of them could have driven themselves 1,000 kilometres across roadless bush to reach the battle in the first place. That was the whole point that the doctrine missed. The Ratel was not trying to be a better tracked IFV. It was a different answer to a different war, one where range and reliability and self-deployment and mine survival mattered more than the last increment of cross-country grip or armour thickness. Measured against the war it actually fought, the Ratel's wheeled heresy was simply correct, and in the decades since, the world quietly came around to South Africa's point of view. The wheeled fighting vehicle that European doctrine dismissed in the 1970s is now everywhere. The great armies that once insisted an IFV must have tracks today field fleets of wheeled, eight-wheeled fighting vehicles, prizing exactly the qualities the Ratel pioneered: strategic mobility, the ability to self-deploy over huge distances, reliability, and low running cost. The Ratel served South Africa for decades and was exported abroad, and its hull and its hard-won lessons fed directly into the vehicles that followed it, including the powerful wheeled armoured cars that replaced the old Eland. The Honey Badger did not just win its own war. It helped redefine what a fighting vehicle could be, and the whole world eventually followed. October 1987, the Lomba River. A tall wheeled box that every serious army said could never fight a tank, moved through the bush towards Soviet armour, and the doctrine of the age said it was the wrong shape, the wrong choice, a compromise that would shatter the moment it met real tanks. It had no tracks, no heavy armour, no business in an armoured battle at all, and yet it hunted those tanks through the bush and killed them, struck from the flank and the rear with a gun. It was never supposed to use that way, and drove itself 1,000 kilometres home to do it again. It was named for the fearless little animal that attacks lions, and it earned the name in full. The experts measured it against the tracked vehicles built for a European war that never came, and by that measure, it looked wrong. They never understood the war it was truly built for. The war of vast distances and no roads and buried mines. The war where the vehicle that can actually reach the battle beats the vehicle that is perfect but stranded 1,000 kilometres away. That is not luck, and it is not just bravery. That is what happens when a nation forced to build for the war it will really fight stops copying everyone else's answer and builds the Honey Badger instead.